Um, my name is Stacy Holder. I coordinate classes and events for Precision Camera. Thank you very much for joining us today. We've got a really great partnership with a lot of the manufacturers at the store, Sigma especially. And Brett has done workshops for us in the past, including riding around on a cart in a field of animals and taking pictures for a safari type workshop out in West Texas. So he's joining us today. Where are you actually, Brett?
I am home in Atlanta.
Atlanta, yeah. So joining us from the fine state of Georgia. With no further ado, though, Brett's going to talk to us today about macro photography. Thanks for being here, Brett.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And glad to be able to partner with a dealer and be able to do things like this and talk to customers. And it's kind of fun. Haven't been out a lot, like a lot of you, I'm sure. So this part's kind of nice. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself since we've got another minute or two, just in case somebody, no sound. Uh-oh. Can anybody else hear me? Can everybody hear me? Yep, okay. So there's somebody who is having trouble with audio. Make sure that your speakers are turned up. Okay. Okay, so somebody's going to help with that. I am tuning in from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm on the north side of town, if you know the area at all. I am the tech rep for Sigma Photo for the Southeast. I'm also the national education coordinator for Sigma as well. A little bit of background, I've been in photography for about 25 years. I have a master's degree from the University of Westminster in London, England. I taught photography at the Art Institute of Atlanta for 7.5 years. And I've been in the sales and marketing side now about 13 years, 12, 13 years, something like that. I've worked for Sigma for most of that time in various capacities, starting as a sales rep, and then moving into tech, and then getting more involved in education as well. So, like I said, glad to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you have questions, I'll try to pay attention to that. There's a lot of different things going on, and this is kind of new for me, but I think it's working all right. Excuse me. So, the first thing that I like to do with, how do I move picture? There we go. When I'm talking about macro is just to make sure that we're all on the same page. That when I say macro, what I generally mean is one-to-one or equipment, a lens, whatever that's capable of reproducing at one-to-one. That's kind of the technical definition of macro, and I guess it really goes from there to about 100-to-1. But realistically speaking, we're talking about 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, meaning double life size or triple life size at the most. Not that we're going to take every picture that way, but that's what we're capable of doing. Okay. The second then is a lot of lenses will say they're macro. They'll have that designation on the lens, but it may or may not actually be a macro lens or that true macro 1-to-1. It may be something that's only capable of reproducing maybe a half of life size or a third of life size, but that's a lot more than an average lens would be able to do. You know, your kind of average mid-range 50 to 85 millimeter lens, say, is capable of about a quarter or a fifth, maybe 20 or 25% of life size reproduction. Okay. In order to get to macro, a lens has to be able to extend. I've got one here I can show you. Oh wait, I can just flip back and forth, can't I? But it's electronic. I can't extend it when it's not on the camera. So the 70 millimeter lens does actually extend externally. And the point of that is, in order to get to macro, a lens has to be able to extend twice as long from the sensor as it was at infinity. And some lenses do that internally, some lenses do that externally, zoom on the outside. But that's going to become important when we talk about one of the accessories down the road here. I'll show you a few images. And the tweak on this for today is talking about how to do macro in your own house. So this is actually a tabletop setup. all done inside. It was lit with LED lights. It's a fake background, a piece of paper printed out of a printer. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we get into accessories, how you could set something like that up on your dining room table. That's in a butterfly garden in South Florida. That was set up in my kitchen. Okay, so what do we use macro lenses for? Casey, somebody else is having an issue with sound. So what do we use macro lenses for? Obviously, a lot of people are going to shoot flowers. People may shoot bugs. I think you can also use macro lenses for documenting hobbies or for insurance purposes, even photographing hallmarks on jewelries or things like that. But a lot of people don't realize macro lenses fall in the portrait range, and they're very, very sharp lenses too. So they work for as very good portrait lenses as well. Sorry, trying to keep up with notes here. So the Sigma lenses that we do make and have made, some of these things change from time to time. The first two are the current lenses. There's a 70 millimeter macro. It's an f2.8. It is full frame. It's available for Canon and Sony and L-mount, which is our camera, the FP, and the Panasonic S1 series of cameras. There's a 105 millimeter macro lens, also a 2.8, also full frame. That one's stabilized, and it is available for Canon and Nikon. Then the two that we just discontinued were the 150 and the 180. Those are all true macro lenses, again, capable of one-to-one reproduction. The other lenses that we make that do macro, about a third life size, is the 18 to 200, the 18 to 300, and the 17 to 70, and they're all capable of right about a third, 1.1 to 3 or 1 to 2.9 reproduction. Okay. A few things to think about when picking a macro lens or purchasing a macro lens. The first is what I call working distance. All the manufacturers have a spec that is close focus distance or minimum focus distance. And that is a measurement from the subject to the sensor in the camera when it's focused at macro or at its closest. The problem with that definition or that measurement is the camera body extends in front of the sensor and the lens extends in front of the sensor, and then some lenses extend more as they focus to macro. So it's not giving you a really good idea how close the front of the lens is to the subject when you're focused at macro. So what I've done is go through and measure a lot of different macro lenses and create a chart. And I'll show that to you in just a second. That will tell you, what that close focus distance or that working distance actually is from the front of the lens versus what the manufacturer claims it is. But there's something to consider, because really short macro lenses, you might be right up on top of the subject and you might be blocking the light that is coming over your shoulder. You also may intimidate something. You might get too close if you're trying to shoot a bug. There's a lot of reasons that you might want to be a little bit farther back. The other side, though, can also be true. So with a long lens like a 150 or a 180, in order to shoot something larger, like a full-size flower, like a rose maybe, you could end up being 3 feet away, and sometimes you can't back up that far. There have been times that I've been photographing in a park and I just couldn't back up across the trail anymore without falling over the edge. So there's kind of, to me, there's a sweet spot in between, and we'll talk about that in a second too. The next thing to look at is angle of view, and that is what you're going to be able to see behind the subject, basically. Any macro lens is capable of one-to-one reproduction if it's a true macro lens, which means the subject is going to be represented the same size. But if I have a wider lens, like a 50 or a 60, it's going to see more background. If I have a longer lens, like a 150 or a 180, it's going to see a lot less of the background. That may or may not, again, there's no right or wrong to this, but if you're seeing a lot of background, if you want to see a lot of background behind the image, a flower with the forest leaves and behind it and everything else, then you might want to use a shorter lens. If you want to try to isolate the subject from the background and not see all the distracting things behind it, then you might want to use a longer lens. Just something to think about when you make your choices in macro lenses. Stabilization. If you're going to handhold macro shots, I highly recommend a lens with stabilization. It's hard enough to get good, sharp macro pictures with all the depth of field that we want already. And if we have stabilization, that's just going to help us do that a little bit more. The obvious things, the size of the lens, the weight of the lens, the price of the lens. Everybody knows their own budget, but you can buy macro lenses for $400 or $500. You can buy macro lenses for $2,000. The big macro lenses can be as large as a 70 to 200, or even larger and heavier. Smaller macro lenses can be very lightweight and very manageable. So that's something else to think about. How much are you going to handhold it? Does it fit in your camera bag? Those kind of things. And then I like equipment that I can do more than one thing with. I don't like spending a lot of money on something that just does one thing, unless I'm going to plan to do that a lot. So what else can I use this lens for? And we talked about some of the other uses for macro lenses as well. Excuse me. So like I said, working distance is different from close focus distance. So a lens in the 50 to 70 millimeter range, and I've tested ours and I've tested other manufacturers, this is going to be very, very similar across the board. You're going to be around 2 to 3 inches from the front element of the lens, or the very front of the lens, to your subject. That's pretty close. A 90 to 105 millimeter macro lens, you're going to be back closer to 5 or 6 inches, and that gives you a lot more working distance. The 150 would be 7.5 at maximum at 1:1, and the 180 is 8.75. The lenses that are typically a third life size or a quarter life size may not have quite even that 3 inches. Some of them can be down at 1.5 inches or 2 inches when they're at their maximum magnification. Now keep in mind, you're not always going to be shooting at 1:1 or at maximum magnification. So if you're at half of that, you're going to be basically twice the distance back from those measurements. So that becomes a lot more manageable as well. The question really comes down to what type of things do you want to shoot, big or small, more often than others. And that's our 100 to 400. That's not really even a macro lens, but it allows me to get close enough to fill the frame with a butterfly that's probably 3 inches from his body to the top of his wings. But then those little flowers are maybe 1 inch wide. Yeah, good point. If anybody has any questions, please. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat there. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt, and I'll definitely make sure there's time at the end for that as well. Some accessories that you might want to think about. A tripod is a really, really nice thing to have, especially when you're shooting indoors and you can isolate all the motion, put a flower on a table, there's no breeze. You can set everything up, leave it for an hour to go eat lunch, and then come back and keep working on it. So having a tripod to get the camera out of your hands is a really, really useful tool. Any tripod's better than nothing, but a little bit more sturdy tripod for some of the bigger macro lenses. Keep in mind that you're magnifying the motion of the camera along with magnifying the subject. So something that's really stable is nice to have, but anything is better than nothing. I like Arca Swiss style tripod heads, and Arca Swiss is just a standard of plate, and there's a few reasons for it. One of those is it's the closest thing to a universal plate. So a lot of different manufacturers make accessories that will all work together, that you can interchange, whatever, use one plate on a different tripod. So they're easier to find. There are also accessories like macro rails and L brackets for your cameras and those kind of things, which will also work together and work with that same head. So you're not having to buy multiple tripod heads just to be able to do something a little bit different than what you normally would do. A cable release is a really nice thing to have for this. I find that even pushing the shutter release button is enough of a shake to make a difference in an image, especially when I'm shooting something longer, like a quarter of a second. So having a way to trigger the camera without actually pushing the button on the camera is a good thing to have. If your camera takes a mechanical cable release, more power to you. Most of them don't. Most of them are electronic today. There's a huge range of options. All you really need is something that has a simple trigger for this. If you don't have a cable release, the timer in your camera will work pretty well. Again, especially at home, if I have a tabletop setup and nothing's moving, then having using the timer in the camera is perfectly fine. Okay, a long lens plate, just a tripod plate or the plate that goes on your camera, just longer, and there's a reason for that. If a lens has a tripod foot on it, switch back to me here. I don't have one with a foot. This one does. So if I have a lens that has a foot like this, I can get a long plate and attach it to the bottom of the lens, and I can actually slide the lens forward and backward in the tripod head, and that allows me to more precisely position the camera a little bit closer to a subject or farther away from the subject without having to pick up the whole tripod and move it around. This is actually something called a macro rail, so it clamps your camera back here in the back, and then the tripod clamps here, and the whole thing can slide forward or backward. These come in all sorts of different lengths, and this can be something useful as well. It's probably in the list. Any kind of light can be very beneficial. Whatever you have will work just fine, or will work better than nothing. The lights in your house can be very warm. It's different now with LEDs and fluorescents. Color temperature of lights is all over the place. With tungsten, it was easier. Close was I to the bugs? Are you talking about the butterflies? Or the bee? The butterflies? So like that, I'm probably 3 feet away with 100 to 400. I'd be closer to like 2 feet away with a longer macro lens, like the 150 or the 180. Sure. Let's get back to this. So any kind of light, again, is a nice thing to have. If you position a table next to a window, you can use that window light. And that's really, really nice. You can use a reflector on the other side and bounce light back into the darker side of your subject. You can use, there are dedicated macro flashes. Again, you can go anywhere from low end to thousands of dollars for kits that have rings on the lenses and multiple flashes that position in different places. And so that's an option as well. I'm starting to use more and more LEDs. So an LED panel, this one's a little bit big. You can use smaller panels, and these, a lot of them have some sort of bracket that you can attach to a light stand or to a tripod. So if you have extra tripods, which a lot of us have managed to collect a lot of tripods over the years before we learned that it was worth buying a really good tripod, or any kind of light stands, you can even tape stuff to chairs, and I've seen all sorts of different rigs for these kind of things. But any way that you can bring light to a macro situation is going to be good. Even if you're shooting outside, it can be really, really helpful to get the shutter speeds faster so you can freeze motion better. It's also nice to have light because your subject may be in a shadow and the background's bright, or you might want to light up the background, or you might want to, something like that. Okay. Reflectors are a nice thing to have too. I like little 5-in-1, something about 18 inches to 2 feet is perfectly sufficient. Anything bigger than that and you're outside, it tends to be a sail. The wind catches it and it blows away, and it's just hard to manage. So, and we're shooting tiny stuff, so a small little reflector is fine. The 5-in-1s are really great because you have a black surface and a white surface, so you can bounce light and absorb light. You can use one of those as a background in a pinch. The diffusing material you can hold over your subject or between the light and the subject and soften the light, which just decreases the contrast range, fills in the shadows, makes them a little bit more pleasing. So there's a lot of things that you can do with a small reflector, again, inside or outside. A few other accessories, kind of getting a little bit more advanced, but if you remember from one of the first slides, we talked about a macro lens becomes a macro lens by extending farther and farther away from the sensor. Well, if I could take a normal lens, like a 50 or an 85 or whatever, an average lens, a standard lens, and extend it farther away from the camera than it was originally designed for, I'd be able to focus closer. And if I can focus closer, the subject's going to be bigger. So what they have created are these things called extension tubes. They usually come in sets of 3, and they are just a hollow ring. There's no optics in it. They usually come, like I said, in sets of 3. So there's a thin one, a medium one, and a taller one. You can use them in any combination, 1, 2, or 3. They're available in just about every camera mount under the sun. And they basically come in 2 varieties, with electronics and without electronics. If you're going to do this, you definitely want the one with electronics, because a lot of lenses today won't function without some communication with the camera. The apertures don't open. They won't. If there's a shutter in there, they won't fire, whatever it is. You definitely want the ones with electronics. So you can use this to space out a normal lens. You can also use this to space a macro lens even farther away from the camera and focus even closer and get even more magnification. So with something in the kind of 70 to 105 millimeter range, you should be able to get about 2 to 2.5 times life size with a set of extension tubes. There's a little chart in the box when you buy it that'll tell you with this lens, with each ring, how much you're going to get, how much magnification you're going to get out of it. I mentioned the macro rail already. It's also known as a nodal rail because it's used for shooting panoramics. That's another class. A soft brush and a spray bottle. The soft brush, you can use a makeup brush. You can use a really big soft paint brush, like an artist brush, not a paint your wall kind of brush. But it's a nice way to clean out flowers. Even if you buy flowers at a garden store, they were grown in a greenhouse or outdoors somewhere, there can be dead bugs inside the flowers or little pieces of debris, whatever. So you can actually use that paintbrush to clean out a flower and make it beautiful. You can do those things in Lightroom and Photoshop later, but you can save yourself a lot of time by doing that beforehand. And a spray bottle, this is something that I was taught in photo school for shooting product photography. But you can go to a drugstore and find glycerin. You can mix it about 50-50 glycerin and water, and put it in a spray bottle. When you spray it on something, it has a lot more viscosity than water. It will look like the most beautiful morning dew, but the little droplets will cling to the flower and they won't evaporate. They won't roll off and they won't evaporate. You can even take the pure glycerin and a toothpick and put drops of glycerin on your flowers to make it look like you shot at sunrise. A Plamp is a product from Wimberley. It is just, I don't know, can you guys see? If I do that, it gets bigger. This part clamps on a light stand, a tripod, edge of your table, whatever it may be, and this part goes around the stem of a flower and allows you to position the flower a little bit more, and if you're shooting outside especially, can help to keep the flower from blowing around in the wind. Just a gadget they made for macro photography, especially flower photography. And then backgrounds, like I mentioned before, that one shot of the orchid that was inside the two flowers. So this is something I learned from a friend of mine. You can photograph any kind of thing as a background. You can photograph the sky, the woods, other flowers, grass, whatever you can think of. And you just want to take it into Lightroom or Photoshop and blur the image, soften it, so that it looks like an out of focus background would if you were shooting in camera. Print it out, 11 by 14, 16 by 20, depending on how big you're going to use it, and tape it on the wall, put it on a stand. Some people put them on cards and have a little prop to hold the card up. And you can just set that right behind your subject and photograph in your living room when it's pouring down rain or snowing outside, and make it look like it's the most beautiful summer day or whatever it may be. But that can help you expand the possibilities and the opportunities to shoot macro kind of things, even when you can't get outside to do it. And if you have beautiful flowers outside, you don't mind digging one up, you can just pull one in and clip it somewhere, put a background behind it, bring some kind of lights in, even a table lamp can help, whatever it is. Position that around your subject, and again, you can spend all afternoon tweaking and getting the exact shot that you really want. To give you an idea what we can do with light, if I bring light in from the side a little bit, it will help to pronounce the textures in a subject. By lighting the foreground or lighting the subject, it's also going to darken the background, because all I've done is brighten the subject. My camera then is going to adjust the exposure, or I'm going to adjust the exposure so that it comes out evenly, or comes out properly exposed, but the background didn't get as much light in the situation, so it's going to get darker as that goes. Some people prefer really, really dark backgrounds, even black backgrounds when they shoot flowers. Totally a personal choice. But that's basically how they do it, is by throwing more and more light on the subject, not allowing that light to hit the background, and the background will just go darker and darker. You obviously can put a black card or a black reflector behind the subject, but even those are going to reflect some light. So keeping light off of that and adding light to the subject helps to darken that more and more. That's with the extension tubes. So that was a 70 macro without the extension tubes, and with all three of the extension tubes on there. And like I said, as best I can tell, that's right about 2.5 or 3 to 1. I apologize, the conversion of some of these slides isn't perfect, but I'll leave you with a few tips, and then I'll give you my starting points. That's a common question that I get. The first tip is the lens is more important than the camera. And I know that sounds like a sales pitch coming from a guy who sells camera lenses, but for macro, it's really, really, really true. By focusing really close, you're using less of the glass, you're putting a lot of demands on the lens. And if you really want to get to close-up, real close-up photography, you need something that is dedicated to doing that and does it really, really well. You can actually do a lot with basic cameras today. Even the entry-level cameras are great at doing macro. They have great resolution, great exposure meters, all of those kind of things. So almost any camera that you're likely to have can do a pretty good job for macro already. But it's some of those accessories make a big difference, and the lens is going to make a big difference. The next thing is eliminating motion. One of the easiest things to do is bring your subject inside. It really, really does make a difference in keeping eliminating motion when you're outside. Even if you think it's the most beautiful, calm, still morning and there's not a tiny bit of breeze, as soon as you set up your camera in front of the flower and look through the viewfinder or turn on the live view, you can see the flower shaking back and forth. And so it's a lot easier to be able to come inside. That's one way to eliminate motion. Adding light allows us to increase shutter speed. That's going to help eliminate motion as well. Using some kind of flash, again, but that's just more and more light, will help to eliminate motion. Last resort is we keep turning our ISO up higher and higher, but ideally we want to keep the ISO as low as possible because it's going to give us cleaner images, just better looking images. Okay, the next one is for exposure. Macro lenses eat light. Excuse me, and that's not entirely true. That's not exactly how it works, but as I extend the lens farther and farther and focus closer and closer, the image circle, the light thrown or cast through the lens projected onto the sensor, that circle gets bigger and bigger. So it's the same amount of light spread over a greater area. I have less light per square inch, per square millimeter, however you want to look at that. The sensor is getting less overall exposure, to the extent that at 1:1, at true macro, any lens is going to lose 2 stops of light. It's just physics. There's nothing you can do about it other than compensate with your shutter speed or aperture ISO. A little trick, Nikon shows you what's happening on the LCD screen. If I start at 2.8, leave my aperture alone and just focus the lens closer and closer and closer, you will actually see the aperture on the LCD screen change from f4 to f5.6. Nothing moved. The mechanism in the lens did not close down. It's just showing you the equivalent aperture or the effective aperture after the lens lost those 2 stops of light. Canon does not do that. Canon doesn't show you a different f-stop number. It keeps it at 2.8 in that situation or in that scenario, but it will adjust the exposure through the shutter speed or ISO as though you lost those 2 stops of light anyway. So it's the same thing. It just, a lot of people, it trips them up if you're shooting with a Nikon and you see that number change on this screen, or if you're shooting at maximum and you're trying to open up and the lens won't go to what the lens says is the maximum aperture, and that's why. Depth of field. As I focus closer to the camera, I get less and less depth of field. When I focus at infinity, if I'm shooting mountains in Colorado 50 miles away or 20 miles away or whatever, I'll have everything from 100 feet in front of me to that mountain and the sky in the background all in focus, even at f8 or f11. When I take a portrait of somebody 6 or 8 feet away, I may only have a foot or two of depth of field at f8, maybe a couple feet. As I focus closer and closer, 2 feet away, I may only have a few inches. And when I'm at true macro, inches away from a subject, I may only have a half an inch of depth of field or a quarter of an inch of depth of field, maybe less, really down to millimeters of depth of field. There are only a few things that you can do. The first is turn the aperture higher. There is a trade-off. It's a question that I get. What about, what's the word I'm looking for? Apologize. Diffraction. So light rays bend a little bit and your image softens a little bit when the aperture is really, really small, which is the high numbers like f16 or f22. My theory is I'd rather have a picture with the depth of field I wanted that wasn't quite as sharp as the camera could do rather than an image that wasn't all in focus the way I wanted it in the first place. Ideally, we'd have everything, but sometimes that's not a possibility. You can back up. Today's cameras have a lot of resolution. If you back up a little bit, you'll get more depth of field. Then you focus at the longer distance to the subject, you'll have more depth of field. You'll just have to know that when you get back to your computer, you're going to plan to crop into the image. That's another option. There is one other thing that can be done, and that's called focus stacking. We could spend an entire day talking about that, but it's basically taking different pictures of an image at different points of focus through the image, and then allowing the computer or reprogramming the computer to stack that back together so that everything is in focus. Lightroom and Photoshop will do it. I use a software called Zerene, Z-E-R-E-N-E. There's another one, Helicon Focus, does it as well. I think those two do a better job than Lightroom and Photoshop. I'll show you an example, but like I said, that's really a full class on another day. One more tip, and that is composition. Be creative. You've already paid for the camera, you've already paid for the lens, your gear, the memory card. The worst you're going to do is fill up a hard drive, but of course you can just delete the images that you don't like. So I always try to encourage people, shoot from far away, shoot close up, shoot from the side, shoot from above, lay down on the ground and look up at something. Try as many different compositions as you can. If you're not sure what the depth of field is going to be exactly when you get back to the computer, try them all. Shoot a picture at f5.6, shoot one at 8, shoot one at 11, shoot one at 16. Make sure that you're changing your aperture ISO to compensate, or the camera's doing that for you. But try out all those. Thank you, dude. Try out all of the different possibilities. The more you do, the more you'll learn that in the next time you're in that situation, at really close up, that f5.6 just isn't going to give you enough depth of field. You don't even need to start at that point. Or f22 on a windy day is almost impossible. So that kind of gives you a starting point as well. Like I said, I'll give you a few suggestions. People always ask, what's your favorite macro lens? And I probably shouldn't say this since we just discontinued it, but my absolute all-time favorite macro lens is the 150. And I'll tell you, I shoot on a full-frame camera, and I shoot a lot of closer things. And to me, that's the best compromise between all the different options. For most people, I recommend a 105 on a full-frame camera and a 70 on an APS-C camera. That's going to be the most flexibility, the most practical, the most all-around macro lens that's going to do almost anything you'd ever want to do macro without really giving you limitations. Settings. So I'm almost always going to start at 800 ISO, maybe even 1000, 1600, something like that, when I'm shooting outdoors and the subject is moving, or there's any kind of wind or anything like that. Aperture starting point, I'm usually starting at f11. And then shutter speed, I'm going to try to keep up to about a 60th of a second to 125th of a second outdoors. Even then, I'm going to use a shutter release, and I'm going to trip the shutter when there's breaks in the wind. If I can see something moving, I'll wait till there's a pause, push the button, wait again, push the button. I may take 30 pictures of the same thing and come back and have 2 or 3 that really don't have any motion in the image. That's one of the reasons a cable release is a lot better than a timer, because trying to predict when the wind is going to stop or gust again is just impossible with the self-timer. Another thing that I should actually add to this list is I use live view a lot. 2 big reasons. One is, well, 3. I don't have to lay down on the ground to look through the back of a camera, especially if I have a tilt screen. I can just tilt it up and look down at the screen. 2, almost any camera has a focus magnification feature. They're turned on different ways through the menus. Apologies. Better? No, we're echoing now. Hang on just a second. All right, can you hear me now? Okay, I think we're back. Live view. Oh, so I focus magnification. I can zoom in to 100% and like really a pixel level and focus critically exactly where I want the focus to be. In general, I focus just a little bit closer than halfway through the image the part of the image that I want in focus. So if I look at a flower from the front of the flower to the back of the flower, I'll focus right around halfway, but maybe a little bit closer. Then I'm going to use depth of field to come closer and farther from that focal plane to try to get everything in focus. And then the third is I can watch on that screen zoomed in to see the flower moving and wait till the wind dies and try to take pictures rather than trying to watch the flower itself. So I can see exactly what the camera is seeing. So I really like live view. It does drain your battery. I won't even say a little faster. It drains your battery a lot faster if you're using an SLR. If you're using a mirrorless camera, you're already using live view. So you're used to how the battery drains using live view in an SLR. I'll show you a few more images here. Those two are outside. That's inside. Again, fake background, LED lights. It's just a picture of the sky, softened. 16 by 20, held maybe a foot behind the subject so that it's nice and soft looking. And then I try to think about reproducing sunlight. So usually the sun's over the subject or a little bit, maybe 45 degrees, and nice warm light. You can play around with those kind of things when you're shooting inside. So to give you an idea of what you can do with something that's not a macro lens. It's not really truly like life size, but it's, I don't know what the magnification would be on it. Maybe 20 or 25% of life size. But it got me exactly what I wanted in the situation. I was teaching a workshop and a bunch of cars following, and one of the guys on the radio says, "Stop, stop, stop, stop." So we all found some place to pull over, got out of the way, ran back, and he had seen this on a fence as we're going around the road early in the morning. All that do is natural. We didn't fake any of this. But my whole class is laying down in the middle of the road with their macro lenses on their bellies, trying to take a picture of this. And a couple of us are keeping an eye on cars moving to make sure that nobody gets hurt. And so I grabbed my lens. I thought, I really want a picture of this, but I don't want to make the class wait for me after they're done. So what could I do? I wonder what the 150 to 600 would do. So I grabbed that and shot over everybody's shoulders, and it actually came out pretty well. That was in a garden in Tennessee, outside of Nashville. There are all sorts of places that you can go. You can bring things in, go to the grocery store, go to the garden store, hardware store. You can buy beautiful, beautiful, beautiful flowers to bring home and play with. You can even groom flowers. So a spray of orchids may have a flower behind that you don't want there. You can just clip it off and style your flowers exactly as you want them. There are all sorts of gardens and places that are starting to open back up that you can get to now and photograph. But hopefully that gives you a good starting point. So you're a little more comfortable with the equipment and some basic techniques to start as well. I will open it up to questions. Anybody? Thank you very much. I know I didn't answer every question. I tried to predict, because I know what a lot of people will ask through the presentations, but would you use strobes to light a macro shot or just constant light? Strobes absolutely are fine. You can use the camera flash that you have. Keep in mind with a macro lens, that little built-in flash or pop-up flash might block, the lens might block the light coming from that macro flash, so that's a problem. A dedicated camera flash that's up above the camera can work fine. They tend to be very, very powerful. So if you use those and adjust the exposure for the subject, the background almost always goes completely dark. You can turn them way, way, way down. So I usually start with a full camera flash. I usually start at like 1/16 power, 1/32 power. Macro flashes, dedicated macro flashes, generally are somewhere in that range to start with. They're usually a quarter or an eighth of the power of one of those full-size flashes anyway. There are different systems out there, and there are all sorts of different brackets. The really serious guys, there's a ring that attaches to the front of your lens, and then there's 2 flashes, and they can position in all sorts of different arrangements. It's a great thing to have. If you're really serious about it, that it can be a really big investment for those type of things too. But yes, flash absolutely can work. Even if you have studio lights and you're comfortable using that, there's no reason that you can't use strobe. The nice thing about flashes and strobes is they are a lot brighter than an LED panel or a flashlight or anything like that. So they're going to freeze motion even better. So if you're shooting outside in a breeze, you're trying to shoot dragonflies in flight. I'm on a Facebook group, and there's a guy in Italy who keeps posting pictures of like bees in flight. I have no idea how in the world you keep a bee in the viewfinder I don't know. But if you're trying to do those kind of things, having strobe will help freeze the motion of the bee or the bug or whatever as well. Will I share my slideshow? I'll be happy to. I have no idea how to do that, but I'm sure Casey can tell us how to do that. Wide angle lenses that are also macro. I think they have their place. There's a classic shot of, in the Smoky Mountains, there's a type of trillium, just a wildflower that you find, trilliums all over the United States, but there's one in particular that the flower actually drops below the leaves and points down at the ground. And there's a famous shot that's usually done with fisheye lenses where you put your camera on the ground, underneath it, you see that flower, and then you see the tree canopy up above. It can be beautiful. You can do some really cool stuff with wide-angle lenses, especially that allow you to focus closer and closer. But they're going to be a more dedicated lens. They're only going to do that type of thing. They're not going to get bugs very well, and then there are all sorts of specialized macro lenses that go more than 1-to-1. There's a lens that's a probe that's, I don't even know how long that you can stick in places and shoot. It's cool. They all seem like really interesting things to try. I've just never decided to buy one of those really dedicated kind of things. But sorry, trying to catch up. The 180 is technically discontinued, along with the 150. I don't believe we have any more inventory in New York. It has not been that long that they've been discontinued, so there's a possibility that Precision might still have one on the shelf or might be able to get one somewhere. I do not know. They don't tell me roadmap on lenses, so I have no idea what gets replaced and when. I absolutely hope that there's a replacement for the 150 and the 180. They were phenomenal macro lenses. There's a website out of Europe that said the 180 is actually one of the 10 sharpest lenses ever made, and the sharpest macro lens ever made. It's only one review, so take it with a grain of salt. But it is a very, very specialized thing. But bug photographers, dragonfly photographers love the 180. Loved the 180. I guess they still do if they have one. So I hope that's the case. Will there be a micro 4 thirds? Again, they don't tell me roadmap. I do know that more micro 4 thirds lenses are in development. That's it. That's all I know. Even if I did know, I couldn't tell you. And that's why they don't tell me, because I would. So we will make sure that everybody that's here today has a link to the presentation. Like I said, I don't have a problem with that at all. I'd love to share that information and help you all shoot. And you can find me as well. I don't know if it shares with you. My email address is bwells@sigmaphoto.com. Casey is doing something to help us here as well. You can always find me through Sigma's Facebook or Sigma's website as well. The Sigma 20 will focus very close. A lot of wide-angle lenses will focus very, very close, and they do get somewhere around that, third life size, quarter life size, sometimes a little bit better. And again, you can do some really interesting tricks with those kind of things too. Yeah. Does the macro flower setting on my Fujifilm attempt to mimic a macro lens? My guess is that it's just going to default your focus to close, depth of field higher. It's just going to try to set things more appropriate for flower photography. But I don't, and shutter speed a little higher than it might think it would normally do, those kind of things. But a lens can only focus as close as a lens can focus without having an accessory like those extension tubes. So I don't know that it would be able to get you more macro capability just with a setting in the camera body. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Precision Camera, for hosting us. We definitely appreciate that. Always glad to share knowledge and passion for macro photography. I'm very glad to be here. I think that may be all the questions. Thank you. Video. Good. Thanks, Casey, for sharing the email address. A brand of extension tubes that I recommend. Honestly, that kind of thing, I think, all comes from the same factory in China. So whatever is in stock at Precision is what I would buy. And I'm not saying that to help them. I just don't see a difference between them. Sigma does not make extension tubes. No. The biggest brand that I know is called Kenko, Kenko. That's the one I see more often. ProMaster, which is a common brand you see in camera stores, they have their own set of them. Cool. Thanks, everybody. It's been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you tuning in today.